talk about the accompaniment that Presbyterian Peace Fellowship has been doing on the border in Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico. My name is Allison Wood. I'm the PPF Accompaniment Coordinator based in Tucson, Arizona, just down the road from Agua Prieta. And I'm excited to share with you all this evening just a little outline of what we're going to do together. I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation in Agua Prieta and the request that we received and PPF's response. And then there are two folks who have been accompaniers this past summer in Agua Prieta on the call, Ruth and Faith, and we'll have some time for them to share, and then space for questions that anyone has or things that you want to share, and then close with some ideas about ways to respond to the situations that we talk about. And we'll talk for no more than 75 minutes, so be done by 6:15 in this time zone at the latest. I know for some of you, Ruth especially, it looks like you're in the dark there, so I know it's late on the East Coast. So this worked pretty well. It worked pretty well to share my screen in the earlier webinar this morning, so let me see if I can figure out how to do that again. If you're not familiar with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, it's an organization that has a 75-year history of nonviolence and peacemaking in the United States and other places. We also have been partnering for the past 15 years with the Iglesia Presbiteriana de Colombia, the Colombian Presbyterian Church, doing accompaniment work there in Colombia. So, and if you're not familiar with what accompaniment is, one way to think about accompaniment is that it's a form of peacemaking in which volunteers are physically present in situations of active or threatened violence, and they to de-escalate situations through context-appropriate actions. It's really all about context, which is why it's important to start talking about the context in Agua Prieta. The slide that you see here shows roughly where Agua Prieta is on the US-Mexico border. This red star you can see in the Mexican state of Sonora. I'll move ahead and it zooms in a little bit. So you can see that Agua Prieta is southeast of Tucson, just across the border from a town called Douglas, Arizona. And it has for decades been in one path in shifting flows of people migrating across the US-Mexico border. And of course, for decades and decades and even centuries and centuries before that, has been part of historical migration patterns for people before the US-Mexico border was imposed. So migration through this area. CAME is the migrant shelter that we'll be talking about in Agua Prieta, which stands for Centro de Atención al Migrante Éxodos. The Center for Attention to Migrants, the name of the center is Exodus. The CAME is hosted by a Catholic church called the Sagrada Familia, which has for more than 30 years, been offering hospitality to people in transit. The Sagrada Familia Catholic Church was one of the places where refugees from Central America stayed during the sanctuary movement before they were essentially trafficked across the border by Christians offering hospitality. And out of this history, CAME was established about 19 years ago. And the folks there specifically decided to name this migrant shelter Exodus, recognizing that the people who are in transit now are in Exodus, fleeing or escaping or moving away from many hard situations. For a long time, for most of that 19-year history, CAME has hosted mostly single men or single migrants, although mostly men, who are traveling to the United States for economic or family reunification purposes. In the last year and a half, the kind of population of folks transiting through Agua Prieta has shifted to being more made up of families, especially who are seeking asylum. Families being one parent with a child or children, or two parents with a child or children. We're not going to talk a whole lot about what the asylum process is like or what it means to seek asylum. We could do multiple hour webinars on that, and those could be led by people who are much more expert than me. I just want to name that the asylum process in the United States is very complicated and is really intentionally not transparent. That the way that our country has decided to set up our asylum process is specifically to try to figure out how we can exclude people and how we can exit people from that process, rather than to make it easier for people to gain asylum, to gain safety in the United States. So the United States making things harder is going to be a theme of tonight's conversation that you'll probably pick up on. So, shifting populations of people into more families, lots more children, and people who are seeking asylum specifically, as opposed to migrating for specifically economic or family reunification reasons. In April of 2018, the Trump administration officially implemented their metering policy, which means that at the port of entries, they deliberately slowed down the processing of asylum petitions by keeping people off of US soil, because US asylum law says that anyone who's on US land has the right to petition for asylum. So you may have seen in other places along the US-Mexico border barriers and guards. I want to show you a little bit of what it looks like in Agua Prieta. This is a kind of a before photo. You can see the US port of entry is kind of at the back of the photo. So this is as if the photographer is standing in Agua Prieta looking north toward the United States, seeing the port of entry. You can see this, this barrier on the left that's just kind of a maybe a 6 foot tall, 7 foot tall fence that separates the pedestrian traffic and the vehicle traffic. And it's pretty casual compared to what it looks like now in this photo. This is a screenshot from a local news in Tucson, but here on the left side of this photo, you can see these repurposed shipping containers that have been welded together, covered with concertina wire, with razor wire, and this kind of additional fence here in the front of the photo. So again, this photo is like taken standing in Agua Prieta looking north toward Douglas. The port of entry would be kind of at the back of this photo as well. You can't see it here, but to go back here on the left where there was just this like slatted fence that you can see through, now there's this very harsh barrier. And the way that metering works is, or one of the ways that metering works is that now there is this, this additional place of entry covered by this tent, where there are 2 to 3 armed guards at all times. And this marks the official transition from Mexico to the United States. So people who pass through this have to show a US some kind of legal permission to enter the United States in advance of the actual port of entry, so that folks who want to petition for asylum are held south of this place, so that they can't make their statement of fear and begin their asylum process. So just to the right of this, so just to the east of this, and kind of on the right side of this photo is the border wall and this kind of makeshift tent area called the line. And I'll talk more about this just in a minute, but the metering process means that folks are being forced to wait on the south side of the US-Mexico border. Came is the only migrant shelter in Agua Prieta. And so the staff at Came key wait list called, which means that when someone or people arrive in Agua Prieta intending to make an asylum petition, they first have an interview with the shelter coordinator, and we're not going to share names of people, which we've been asked to do for safety. So they do this interview, and then their names are placed on the list. Right now, or when I was in Agua Prieta in August, mid-August, the folks there said that there were about 650 people on the wait list, which seems simultaneously like a lot of people, especially knowing that this is a pretty small town and is a low number of people compared to the many thousands of people who are on a similar list in Tijuana, for example. But but that's the list, and this is the kind of weight that people are facing. So the way that the process kind of works is that folks who enter to Agua Prieta with the intention of making asylum petition are interview at the shelter. Their names are added to the list. Kame, as the only migrant shelter in Agua Prieta, has a capacity of about 50 people. And so as spaces open up, they receive more folks, but many people who are lower down on the list just have to make do, sleeping on the street, staying in safe hotels if they have the resources, and waiting for the kind of safety of Kame. As folks move up the list, they're able to enter Kame, and then the folks who are right at the top of the list and preparing for their names or numbers to be called stay here in this kind of makeshift shelter right outside the entry point to the port of entry, because they don't want to miss their turn when their number is called. So that's the kind of general situation. I talked a little bit about the Sagrada Familia Church. I would also name that there are mission coworkers from the PCUSA in Agua Prieta and Douglas, and they help coordinate the Frontera de Cristo, which is a binational border ministry that has been active in the area for 30 years, at least 2 decades, but I think more than that. So there's this, hopefully you get a sense of some of the history that hard situations and people in transit in this particular part of the border is not new. Even metering is not new, but it has been implemented now to a higher degree than really we've seen ever before. And this is a problem, in part because people are having to wait for so long in a place where there's not really capacity, although the folks there are committed to hospitality and do so much for the folks that are waiting. The other piece of this picture is that Agua Prieta, like many or most places in Mexico, is controlled by an organized crime group, what we would call a cartel, but what locally they call organized crime or the mafia. And one source of income that the mafia has come to rely on is extortion of arriving migrants and asylum seekers. So in the process that I just talked about with folks arriving in Agua Prieta to make an asylum petition, that is the point at which they, particularly folks who arrive at the bus station, are then approached by members of organized crime who demand hundreds or even thousands of dollars per person before folks are allowed to leave the bus station. Kame is, in their work of peacemaking and hospitality, disrupts this money making for the cartel. And so about 9 months ago, the cartel started to present intimidations and indirect threats toward Kame staff and volunteers. Things like following people, observing them, photographing them in their cars, and escalating to the point even of approaching the shelter manager and telling him, we know where you live, we know where your family lives, we know when you're alone. And so it was this escalation and the whole humanitarian aid community there coming together to recognize this escalation that motivated the request for accompaniment from Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and also from Christian peacemaker teams who have also sent some accompaniers there. The idea is that accompaniers are present with shelter staff and volunteers, and particularly are present with the asylum seekers who are waiting outside the walls of the shelter in order to be visible and to de-escalate and dissuade the organized crime from presenting physical violence. And so far, our partners have said that they feel very much safer and that they're materially safer, as when accompaniers do things like drive folks from Kame to wait at the wall, that is a responsibility out in the open that then shelter volunteers and staff don't have to do. So that is a lot of things. So just take a breath. And it is kind of into the situation that accompaniers were parachuted or were catapulted into, or you know, how your metaphor of choice. And 2 of those accompaniers who were in Agua Prieta this summer Ruth and Faith are on, and this was maybe a good time to ask you all if you'd like to share about your experiences.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just a little bit about why my background. I trained for accompaniment in 2009 and spent a month in Colombia, 2009. And since then, I've been involved with Peace Brigades International, which is a long-term accompaniment organization, not associated with PPF or Presbyterian Peace Fellowship or Peace USA, but that's my connection to accompaniment. And this opportunity to go to Agua Prieta and serve as an accompaniment volunteer really stood out to me because it was an issue of the border, that the border is something that I've never felt directly connected to, but it has always I see it in the news and it bothers me and I want to know how can I help. But this opportunity to go to Agua Prieta really resonated with me because it's something that I had experience with, and it felt very local. It's in my backyard essentially because I live in Northern California. And I don't speak Spanish, but I realized that it was worth it. It's just like in Colombia, it was worth it to be present. And I had the opportunity to be there for 5 weeks. And it was really amazing to be there for 5 weeks because I had the opportunity to feel like that was my life for a few weeks and to really connect with the local community. And I felt really privileged to have that flexibility in my schedule here in California, and to really settle in and make those connections and to see people go through the whole process. I saw people arrive at the shelter and then cross, which I just felt lucky to get to see that whole process. And what it was like to be there what surprised me was really the hope that I saw. It was really amazing to be with people in this part of their journey where they were filled with hope. Because I went filled with anger and frustration at the US policies and the frustrations and just the overwhelming anger sometimes at what's going on. And I expected to at least see some of that in the local community, in the migrants themselves, and I just didn't. It felt emotionally heavy. I felt the fear. But from the local community, I really felt like I was being taught how to both give and receive. So I was, being with the children was sad at times, but in the moment with them, they were just kids. They were just kids, and I just loved being there with them and getting to be a part of their lives. And they were just, I didn't need to speak Spanish to connect with the kids, and I could practice my Spanish with the kids. And the support and love that I saw from the local humanitarian aid community for the migrants and with the migrants and the migrants themselves, the migrants at Kame, it was like a commune. It was like a community where the kids were being parented by adults that they met the day before in a loving way, in a very loving way. And so I just was really astounded and amazed and impressed by the love and the hope that I experienced there. It was easy to forget the dangers because we went on a tour of the city that was hosted by a local journalist who was, a gringo who'd been there for 30 years. And he gave us a lot of information and history about the cartel and about the organized crime. And I got more information and pieces of the intimidations that had been experienced by the local staff and volunteers along the way. And before, without those examples, without them pointing out, oh yes, that's a punto, that's an organized crime member, that's how you tell, that's how you recognize somebody. without them educating my eyes and my vision to see it, it was really a sleepy town. It was that, and even when they pointed out the threats or the people and the houses, like that's a drug house. I never felt directly threatened, but it definitely raised my appreciation and awareness and respect for, again, the local staff and volunteers who are living with that heightened awareness and that tension every day, you know? And so, and the families that are crossing, they know that it's a mess in the US. They know that they might get separated. They know that they might get detained, but they're willing to do it because it's better than what they're leaving behind. And the stories that I heard really just, and so I came away with this really strong urgency to do something at home, to do something here, to raise awareness in my local community, and to stay connected with immigration in a positive way. And I came away with like active plans to go back. I feel connected to the community in Agua Prieta, in Frontera de Cristo and Kame, in ways that I haven't had the opportunity to stay connected with other direct action opportunities and volunteering. In ways that I haven't stayed community, I didn't stay connected or really ever go back to Colombia, but I do look forward to the opportunity to go back to Agua Prieta. And so thanks for the opportunity to share my experience.
Thank you, Faith. Ruth?
Just had to unmute myself there. I also was there at the very beginning of the accompaniment. So it was I had been trained in 2008 and had been to Colombia twice. So this was a very different experience. But when I heard about the possibility of PPF Presbyterian Peace Fellowship doing this, it was an instantaneous recognition inside of myself that this was exactly where I was meant to be. And I also, like Faith, intend to go back. And there will be a training coming up that Allison will talk about more, that I'm actually have at least one person going to, and hope to have a couple other people that I've talked into it. But for me, I was there a much shorter time. I was only there 2 weeks, and I arrived as the first accompaniers were leaving, and had basically an evening and a morning that they trained me in what was specific to Agua Prieta. And I know this will be changing as we've been down there more. But it was quite an experience, because I was met, as I crossed the border, I was met by a Frontera de Cristo staff person until the other accompaniers could come and pick me up, and we went back, dropped my things off at the apartment, and like an hour later we're back, because a typical day is going 3 times from a resource center, which has not been mentioned, which is literally just a block away from this line, this tent shelter that Allison had the picture of. And so we go there, we walk to the line, we bring back people to this resource center so that they can use the bathrooms, because at the line, you could see there were no bathrooms. There is a little restaurant across the street that when it's open, they can pay to use the bathroom or pay to get something to eat. But otherwise, they're dependent on being able to come to this resource center to be able to use bathrooms. We go first thing in the morning around 7 a.m. Then in the middle of the day, we go again. And this time, except for the family that's first in line and might be called to cross the border at any time, unknown time, they shower. That's their one chance to shower. Very creative ways of bathing young children that they've come up with. And the ingenuity, the love that Faith was talking about in terms of not only for their own family, but for caring for each other. There are about 20 people in that tiny shelter you saw. And so you can imagine how they really have to have themselves organized and in order not to be on each other's throats. And yet they really do seem to be good-natured and to maintain that hope. And then we go back again in the early evening, one last time before they can go back to the shelter for the evening. And breakfast is supplied by the shelter. The shelter brings breakfast up to the line. And then lunch is provided by various organizations and congregations on both sides of the border. And they bring it to the line. So that's kind of what the life on the line is like, and our connection to it. And when the times that we're not doing, bringing people to and from the shelter, or the resource center rather, we sometimes sit in the resource center because it's also a drop-in center for people who have questions about loved ones in the US that they can't find, or in one instance while I was there, there was actually a gentleman who had been deported from the US back to Mexico. And he had an indication for that. When they go into detention, they take away all of their things, including belts, jewelry, wallets, cell phones, anything like that. And they're allowed to get that back. And so he had to go back to the border for that, but he didn't want to do that by himself. So that was quite an experience, accompanying him back. And of course they wouldn't let either of us into the building. That very first gate that Allison was showing in her pictures, as far as we got, but somebody then went back. And amazingly, they actually had a big plastic bag like you'd get in a hospital to put your things in, and brought that back, and it had everything in it, including cash. It was quite amazing, and one small side of goodness. The horrendous that are happening to folks along the way. The other piece that we do is when it's a family's turn to move from the shelter to the line, is we will drive to the shelter, pick them up, and drive back to the resource center, and then walk them to the line. And I am a Spanish, not quite as fluent as I used to be, pretty fluent Spanish speaker. And so it's also a time to be able to kind of give them, they've been given an orientation, but to reinforce that orientation and to reinforce that for their safety, it's really important that they stay right there in that line, in that either inside or right outside the shelter, rather than them walking to stores or different places, which of course they're free to do. But it is, if they're not being accompanied, there is the possibility that the organized crime folk who are watching that Faith was talking about will pick them up. So it's an important piece of our reinforcing what the local community is doing. And the local community there is not just CAMI and the Catholic Church or Frontera de Cristo. It's this incredible number of organizations that by the end of the 2 weeks, I was just beginning to understand who was with what and how they were all related, because all of these organizations work together to run the resource center that's right there on the border. So that's an important piece also to be aware of. In terms of what I was expecting and what I saw was, I was expecting to be accompanying the shelter staff and volunteers, but really most of the time we were accompanying the migrants, which is what they needed. And so we're there to serve them. So it doesn't really matter what we thought we were to be doing. What's important is to do what we're asked to do and to be flexible and go with the flow in that regard. I also never really felt that my safety was compromised in any way, shape, or form. But I was, once I had a conversation and was aware of who I was to be watching for in the street, was more alert than I had been previously. But never felt that my safety was compromised. And part of that is because we, as those of us who are going as white US American with a US passport, have a privilege, a totally unearned privilege, that we can do this and no one will bat an eyelash or approach us. And so it's a way to use that privilege in order to provide and walk alongside other people. And that's an important piece of the company. We are walking with, we are not doing for. One of the hardest pieces is the fact was recognizing that our job was just this tiny, tiny little piece of the process, and that there are other organizations all along the process who are helping people. Once they're on the other side of once they're in the US, there are various stages and various groups all along their journey. And the other piece was, I was surprised at who the migrants were. Because in Agua Prieta, they are not mainly Central Americans. They are mainly Mexicans, with some Russians and Eastern Europeans and Asians, and a smattering of other folks. But that was surprising to me. So all this continuously changing family of people in the shelter and people at the line, Spanish might not be a common language. And the Russians or the folks from Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan and the various other countries might or might not know English. So it really is a lesson in communication by many forms. So thank you for the opportunity to present, and we're open to answering questions you might have. And I'll turn it back down.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks to both of you. I really appreciate hearing your reflections and experiences. And just want to lift up a piece that comes up often when we talk about accompaniment, which figures say when we do accompaniment. And I appreciate, Faith, the way that you named that, that Agua Prieta feels like a very safe place. And part of that depends on the privilege that you have or what you look like or what passport you have. And part of that depends on how much you know about what's going on. That in Agua Prieta, our partners have been clear with us that that violence is ongoing and constant, is a constant presence, I think like you both named, but that it's very controlled by the cartel and very directed. And so that is something that we, to a certain extent, take advantage of when accompanying in Agua Prieta, both that because we're not from there and not engaged in those kind of activities, the cartel's activities, that we're not likely to be recipients of violence, and we're by the supremacy of whiteness that operates in the US and in Mexico and on the border, and by the privilege of our US passports. So complicated layers there. I appreciate both of you sharing. Phyllis, would you care to share about your experiences there?
Well, what my experience was like, I'm not sure I've ever been busier. I drove that PPF car from Tucson directly to the resource center, and a Mexican volunteer took me to La Línea right away to introduce me. I was going to be by myself for a couple days, so she wanted them familiar with my face. Then went back to the resource center, and the director of CAME came, and we were getting acquainted. We probably talked about 30 minutes when he received a call that the Mexican military had arrived at La Línea. So his assistant was along also. So the three of us ran to La Línea, as that 2 blocks, and unbeknownst to me until then, apparently I got to Agua Prieta about an hour before the Mexican military had arrived for the first time. And this was, following Trump's orders that they needed to be present. So part of my introduction to the director was watching and listening to the wonderful way he related to those at La Línea who were really alarmed and anxious by this new crisis. You know, he listened and he was calm in imparting the information about which of the state actors could actually ask for identity, who could legally ask for identity documents. And he wanted people, of course, to stay in contact with him then throughout anything that happened in their anything that was of concern that happened. Then eventually another, the person with whom we shared, the Mexican volunteer with whom we shared apartments, arrived at the resource center, and I finally then drove to the apartment and got acquainted with it. But yeah, there was just a lot going on. What was different than I expected, you know, when I first heard about La Nina prior to going, it seemed like a public health crisis waiting to happen. I just couldn't imagine people living in so compactly in the 100-degree temperatures, but indeed, no crisis happened. Instead, I learned how those at La Nina organized and managed their space. You know, when 2 or 3 were called to cross the border, I would transport that same number of migrants from the shelter to La Nina, and those already present would orient the newcomers how to enter that space. And that was just an impressive experience. I saw people of different social, economic classes, different cultures, sometimes no language in common, cooperating together. Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
I witnessed just powerful examples of people taking care of one another, taking risks to care for a stranger. 2 migrants, and I don't know if it's the migrants Ruth referred to, but 2 migrants who'd been kidnapped some weeks prior to my arrival escaped their captors one day and returned to Agua Prieta. And it was known by both the military and the cartels that this had happened, and they were looking for them. So in such circumstances, I learned that those 2 victims were given a priority to cross into the United States. But this was all happening late evening, and so they needed first to pass the night in La Nina, in this line, in this cave. Concerns for their safety and the safety of others at the line. There happened to be 2 Mexican households in the line that particular evening. And so the director asked the 2 Mexican men to sit outside the tent through the night so that they would be aware if either of these, anyone from the cartel or the military came looking for these people. So that happened. And then in the morning, and the kidnapped people were Salvadorans. They were allowed to cross the line, to cross into the United States ahead of people who had been waiting there for several days. So that was just an impressive example to me of people taking risks. There were other things happened too, complicated with people arriving there at that space who were in trouble. What I learned, you know, one thing I learned, I guess we all know this in a certain way. My white skin and U.S. passport make me a powerful person. And I think I just have come to think of an accompaniment in this kind of situation as a constructive use of that privilege and a responsibility. So if I know that there can be, it doesn't provide absolute protection, but I have come to realize don't know, Ruth didn't feel in danger, but the more I learned about the situation, I realized there was a lot of danger present. But we are the least threatened of anybody that's there. So if our presence affords some safety for the day or the time we're there, then I feel a responsibility to do it. It was a powerful learning experience.
This might be a good time to pause and ask if anyone on the call has questions or things that you want to hear more about.
Hi, this is Leslie Vogel.
Go ahead, Leslie.
I'm a mission worker in Guatemala and Mexico, and I was also recently at the border. And I'm only speaking up because I sent a note in the chat. There's a 35th anniversary of Frontera de Cristo happening in November. And I don't know if you've got a flyer for that or if you want to hold that information up in any way. So that commercial break.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll talk more about that at the end, but appreciate you lifting that up as well.
Oh, can I add one more thing? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
This isn't about accompaniment in Agua Prieta, but if I may do another commercial break, I'd like to do that at the end about a trip that's in February. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'll be quiet now.
Okay. Art, it looks like you unmuted. Did you have a question or something to share?
Well, I did have a question. It took me a long time to figure out how to unmute on my iPad. I'm wondering about the sequence of people that are in the waiting area and in the shelter, and then waiting even behind that. Are these lists kept by shelter staff, or are they kept by immigration staff, and then the shelter staff references them? How does that whole kind of sequencing thing work? And is there any prioritization? Do families come before single people or anything like that?
Yeah. Thanks. That's a good question. The list is kept by shelter staff and volunteers, and in some places assisted by branch or associate of the Mexican government called Grupo Beta. That's the kind of Mexican immigration body, one of the Mexican immigration bodies. But in Agua Prieta, it's purely shelter staff and volunteers. The US government doesn't care, essentially. So, and there's, as far as I know, and Faith or Ruth, if I'm getting this wrong, there's not, it's first come, first served. There's not a prioritization. Faith, it looks like.
The only exception to that would be at the line, the US government can call a family of 1, can call a family of 5, can call a family of 4, depending on how many spaces they have. So people can jump ahead of other people, but that's once they're actually at the line in that group of 20. The other thing is, in terms of getting into the shelter, people can jump ahead of other people in the line if there are extenuating circumstances, such as a very newborn child, transgender person, who are even more at risk than everybody else is. So the shelter might take them in ahead of other people, but they don't go ahead of other people in terms of crossing into the US.
Thanks, Ruth.
Yeah, I would just second that. That's about what I was also going to say. And I did see an example of somebody who it looked like he was jumping ahead because there weren't very many single people on the list. So there was a period where the CBP wasn't really calling anybody, and the shelter staff were very deliberate about keeping a variety. Like Ruth said, the CBP might take a single person and a family of 2. And while I was there was a family of 9 that spent a longer than usual time on the line because, and I mean, just to give a little explanation, it's physical space on a bus. So that's how they decide how many cases they'll take that in a day. And I did somebody, you know, it's all managed shelter staff and the local community. And in terms of people who are entering into the shelter, they're also managing people who are waiting at other local shelters. So there's a women's shelter that was feeding people when I was there, that people were moving from the women's shelter into Kame on their way, like moving through the list. So it is managed very detailed by the shelter staff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's
Thanks,
no,
Faith. Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm done.
Thank you. We'll also, we're going to send out an email later this week with an evaluation for this call and some additional resources. And we'll include a link to a video called The Waitlist, made by a group called Doha Debates, that it was filmed in Tijuana, and it goes into a little bit more how the list is kept there. So it might be indicative.
We had some questions in the chat, and I need to apologize briefly because I realized I had a setting on so that you could only chat with me and not ask the whole group. So I have changed that, but if it's okay, I'm going to read aloud some of the questions that we got there. So maybe I'll ask this one because I think that you were just speaking about it, Allison. But are there different processes for Russians versus Mexicans or people from other places?
Not in Agua Prieta to go into the port of entry, and hypothetically no. In practice, yes. Yeah.
Okay, two more questions. One, how has life changed for residents of Agua Prieta, and how do accompaniers interact with members of the community?
Faith or Ruth, do you have thoughts particularly about that, the second question, or things that you learned about the first question?
I would say the first question, I would say I don't know. And the second question, the only member of the community that I interacted with outside of local humanitarian aid organizations was that journalist who gave us a tour, who happened to be a friend of one of the long-term Christian Peacemaker team volunteers who was local. So there was a lot of interaction with the local organizations, Frontera de Cristo, the intern that we shared the apartment with, who was on the other side of the apartment, the local staff and volunteers at Kame, and the other organizations that are part of that humanitarian aid community. A lot of interaction. I mean, they were the family to support and be with the accompaniers, but outside of that community, really, I didn't have any interaction.
And I would agree with that in terms of there's very little opportunity to do that, because one of the things is they really, in terms of for the peace of mind of the shelter staff and Cristo de Frontero, we are basically asked to be traveling in a car when we go places. So we're not out walking much. We can do it a little bit near the apartment. So there's not a lot of opportunity to interact with people unless the few people who dropped into the resource center are the only people that we could really interact with. And that's a very short, brief, no real way to get to know them and socially at all.
Thank you. I would just add that as, so this accompaniment partnership in Agua Prieta started in May, and we had accompaniers on the ground for 3 months. That was a kind of trial period approved by the Activist Council. based on the positive feedback from our partners and the continued request for accompaniment, we're committed to at least 9 more months of presence, and we'll continue to evaluate along the way. But even in that first 3 months, the situation shifted and the ask shifted, and we're building the plane while flying it, as Rick said once. And so we're continuing to find ways that accompagners can connect with the local community. So that if, as I hope, that question came from a place of wondering what it would look like when you, anonymous asker of that question, serve as an accompanier, just know that it's continuing to shift, and there will probably be more opportunities. And for the first question, my sense of how things have changed for your average person who lives in Agua Prieta, I don't have the sense, just from visiting and talking to folks that live there, that it has changed much. People who are friends with the shelter staff and volunteers feel the increased threat that they are facing, and it's hard to be friends with people who are under threat and figure out how to support them and care for them and care for yourself. And this is not new. This is the situation in Agua Prieta right now is a continuation and of exclusionary policies from the US that have existed for a long time. Yeah. Are there maybe a couple more questions? Or Elizabeth, I can't hear you. Try again.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for answering my question. My partner was watching football, so I submitted it to Emily anonymously.
Cool.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We do have 2 more questions in the chat. Is it okay if I share those? Oh, 3. Sorry. Okay, so the question is, how could those of us who cannot come to the border support the work being done there? I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. One obvious answer that I will just name out loud is by donating money to support the work that's being done on the border, if that's within your capacity. Both donating to Presbyterian Peace Fellowship or Frontera de Cristo or there are many amazing organizations that are working in different places around the border. But also prayer is coveted for folks who are long-term residents of the border and engaged in this work long-term, that it is hard to sustain. Prayers for them and prayers for accompaniers who are there and prayers for migrants who are passing through. I think it is also really helpful to invite friends to participate if you have friends who might be interested, specifically in accompaniment, because that's a thing that I'm passionate about, but in other ways of getting involved on the border. And to share stories that you hear from people who are on the ground or from people who have been there, like the stories from Ruth and Faith, that the media and the loudest voices in the United States that we often don't hear those kinds of stories, but that it's really important in reminding ourselves of the humanity of our neighbors and of people who are in transit. And Ruth has, yeah.
Depending on where you live, there may be migrants in your community that you can reach out to. There are many different ways. Locally, there's a group that's meeting migrants who show up at the bus station to welcome them. You know, their sponsor may or may not be immediately there. And so there's various ways that they do that, but there's other groups that are working to get pro bono lawyers when they actually have their case for ICE, or to help them get their children enrolled in schools. There's lots of different ways, if you have migrants showing up in your town, that you can be directly involved as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. That's a good reminder too, that the work on the border that we're talking about is physically on the border, but people of many identities carry the border with them. Folks who have folks who are undocumented or unauthorized or in the immigration process, that the border is lots of places. Emily, was there one more question maybe, or two more?
There's one more question, and then I see that Leslie also has her hand raised, so I'll ask the question and then maybe you can call on her when the answer is done. The question was, is there a church that accompaniers can go to if they would choose to do that?
Yes, there's both a Presbyterian church, and the Catholic church that supports the shelter is right there as well. And there are other churches in Agua Prieta. It has grown over several years from a sleepy little town to Midland size, or, you know, a small city. I mean, what, 50,000, I think now. So yes, there are congregations that you can attend. There's also the opportunity, if you want to cross back into the US while you're there, to do a Tuesday evening memorial service for everybody who's died in the desert. That's done every Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ruth. Leslie, did you have a question?
Yeah, and just to clarify about the, I know that churches exist, but it was more, could the accompaniers get time away to attend church if they wished? I wasn't sure about the restrictions of their responsibilities. And my question, that sometimes there are bus stations that are in transit. So it's not that the people are arriving there to live in your town, but there are, like, I know at least a place in North Carolina and one in Virginia where buses are going through maybe from this part of the border, but all the way to New York, let's say, or Washington, D.C. And there are church and university people who know the times when the buses come through, and they go down to the bus station, take diapers, sandwiches, bottles of water, just to kind of refill. Because folks, when they leave the bus station, let's say in Tucson, have something with them, but it's a long bus ride. It's, you know, a couple or 3 days. And so there are even places en route where people just show up for an hour, share stuff with the folks that are moving along, and then so yeah, there's migrants all over this country. Solamente.
Thanks, Leslie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Leslie, I'm glad that you said that, and several other people have mentioned like how to kind of take this back into communities, because I think one of our partners in Colombia through the Colombia Accompaniment Program often talk about the kind of weekend learning of minutes. So we do that before folks accompany, and they say that's really the orientation. The accompaniment itself is the training, and then the work is to go back and change unjust U.S. policies. And this accompaniment program, like the Colombia Accompaniment Program, is also a partnership with World Mission, who Leslie works for, and other folks. So we're really grateful to get to partner with the Peace USA World Mission, and it also means that we work closely with the Office of General Assembly and Office of Public Witness on some of these issues around advocacy. So I hope that you'll kind of stay tuned and stay connected through email for advocacy alerts and other ways to be connected kind of in your local community and doing advocacy work wherever you are.
Thanks, Emily. And speaking of unjust U.S. policies, as a transition, just to share a couple other pieces for you all to be aware of that are alive on the border right now. So we talked about metering as a policy of the United States. The Mexican National Guard has also been involved. We've seen over the past couple months in Agua Prieta and other places along Mexico's northern border that the Mexican National Guard was created last year by the López Obrador administration in Mexico, and was deployed, I guess you could say, to Mexico's northern border by responding to a request from our president, from President Trump, from our administration. The optimistic part of me would hope that that would increase people's safety, but actually what our partners there have seen is that the Mexican National Guard actually are a threat to shelter operations and to migrants. We'll include in our email later this week that a communique that we received from CAME after Mexican National Guard members demanded entry to the shelter and were intimidating some of the staff members there, or some of the volunteers there, as well as a report from a shelter that is part of the network that that CAME is part of, but the shelter in Saltillo that actually witnessed some violence from Mexican National Guard members against migrants that were trying to run away from them. So that is one place. Another place where the U.S. Has been directly involved in escalating the situation and in increasing the threat. I also just want to mention briefly, because you might have heard about it in the news in the past few months, the migrant protection protocols, as they're called, or return to Mexico policies that were implemented this January in some places along the border, where our administration has decided to return some folks to Mexico, folks from Central America specifically, to Mexico to wait out the course of their asylum case. And then those folks have to go to court along the border in the US. So just to say that as of in June, at the end of June, the Mexican government reported that about 15,000 people had been returned to Mexico to wait out their cases. And that's happening in Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana and Mexicali. So not in Agua Prieta, but that is a possibility depending on how that program moves forward, which puts those migrants at risk, being returned to places that are controlled by organized crime and have low resources, low capacity to support another population of people, and makes it harder for those folks to pursue their cases, their asylum cases. So I'm going to share just a few more photos with you all as we move toward wrapping up. And I know how to do this. So this is again the border wall between Douglas and Agua Prieta. This is the U.S. side of the wall, the north side of the wall. In November of this past year, U.S. National Guard members were deployed to our southern border, and in Agua Prieta, their time was spent putting up concertina wire, ostensibly to increase national safety, national security. And Douglas and Agua Prieta, these border towns that are across the border from each other, are a shared border community. And I think that it's important to remember that both that the border is an imposition in this area, and that these kinds of policies are not created by people who, mostly are not created by people who are actually on the ground, on the border. So we also know that violence is in lots of places around the world. And I do want to lift up in this time that that in the Iglesia Presbiteriana de Colombia, in Colombia, where PPF also has been invited to accompany, although peace accords were signed in 2016, that peace is precarious and is being increasingly undermined by the Colombian presidential administration, current administration, including a recent request or suggestion, the FARC, armed groups, armed parties that laid down arms as part of the peace accords, that one of their ex-commanders suggested that they take back up arms in order to in response to the Colombian government not following through with their side of the peace accords, and that our partners in Colombia remain committed to peace, and I would just ask for your prayers of support for them. And as you're considering ways to support peace and nonviolence, that is an important place to think about it too. I bring that up as well because we have our an upcoming Learn and Discern event, which is a training event for accompaniment. If you discern a call to serve in Agua Prieta, you could wear one of these amazing vests like Faith and Ruth are modeling in this photo. You too could be this cool. I know it's hard to believe. This Learn and Discern event that's happening October 11 to 14 in Montreat, North Carolina, will prepare people for service both in Colombia and Agua Prieta. So talking about peace building in lots of different contexts. Also want to lift up that as you're thinking about ways to respond to violence in the world, that September 20th to 23rd, there's going to be Days of Prayer and Action for Colombia. And the theme this year is Let's Make a Pact for Peace. So that's something that you as an individual or as could get your church involved in, and we'll send out more information on that as well. The last kind of piece before I turn it over to Leslie for her second commercial break is to highlight the anniversary event that she mentioned, that Frontera de Cristo and the Presbyterian Border Region Outreach organization, I guess, are hosting a, I think, 35th anniversary weekend event in November 8th through 10th in Agua Prieta and Douglas. And the theme is Gospel, Hospitality, and Empire. It's going to be a really powerful event, and would be a great opportunity as you're considering accompaniment, would be a great opportunity to connect with the community there and see what it's like. Leslie, you had another piece to share?
Yes, thanks. I don't have a flyer to post up there, but I could send it to you all and you could share with your other links.
Yeah.
The World Mission and the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program is organizing a trip in February called Migrant Trails. And it's looking at both root causes of why people are migrating and also what's happening to people who are being deported back. And yours truly and several of my colleagues are putting it together. So I just wanted people to be aware of that as well. If you want to go to some of the countries people are migrating from and learn more about different aspects of this whole picture, you're welcome to apply. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And we'll look forward to sharing more information about that.
Thank you.
This week as well. Yeah. Does anyone have we have a couple minutes, any questions that you all have been sitting on or things that you're wondering about or that aren't clear? I know that all of this is totally clear as a system. Cool. Then I would just, I'd like to close by saying thank you again for calling in and for participating. Thanks to Faith and Ruth for sharing your experiences and stories. Thank you all for listening and being engaged in hearing about this work and in considering ways that you might involve yourself in this work. I want to close by sharing this piece written by Susan Webb, who was an accompanier in Colombia several years ago. She wrote, "Being an acompañante, being an accompanier, is to engage in the ministry of presence. It's not about changing, fixing, or even helping. It's not about analyzing or diagnosing, recommending or advising. It's about being there as wholly and fully as possible, present to God's movement within you and those you came to stand beside." When I think about the complexity of the situation on the border and the asylum system designed to be opaque and unhelpful, and the longevity and depth of institutions that are excluding people and engaged in perpetuating violence, I am glad for a mind that's not about judging or analyzing or diagnosing, that we are called to be fully present and to be confident that God is fully present with us and with the people who invite us to be with them. So in the confidence of God's presence, I want to thank you one more time for being here this evening and wish you all a very good night.
Buenas noches. Oh.
Good night, everyone.